All right, folks, good evening. Welcome from the high plains of western Nebraska to another edition of the Protestant line number 8. We have with us this evening Dr. Gabriel Williams, Associate Professor of Atmospheric Physics. Would that be right?
Yeah, you got it right.
At the College of Charleston in Charleston, South Carolina. How are you doing, sir?
I'm doing quite well. How are you doing?
I'm great. It's good to have you with us. I just want to get us started by having you tell us a little bit about your background and how you became and where you're from. Because I know you said you were born in New York, but you didn't grow up there. You did. Is that you did?
That's correct. So, in terms of my background, quick little family history. My father was an immigrant from Grenada, and so I'm a first generation in that sense. And he came to New York City to make a new life in the late 1970s. So I was born in New York City at that point. And then my mother's side of the family, they live throughout the Northeast. So New York City, Philadelphia, Columbus, Ohio, sort of that area. And I'm pretty young. So I was born in 1984. And at that point, when I was getting to be around 7 years old, Atlanta, Georgia was basically thought of as kind of a black Mecca in a sense. And so a lot of people, a lot of black people flocked to Atlanta, and we were one of those. And so when I was about 8 years old, we moved from New York City to Atlanta, and that's where I was raised. We lived right outside on the eastern side of Atlanta. And I was raised there. I went to college there. I went to a college called Morehouse College. It's a historically black college. It's the same place that Martin Luther King went to college, is what most people know about that particular place. In terms of my kind of interest, when I was a high school student, I wanted to basically do general business. So I was really interested in construction work and things of that nature. But at the same time, I was taking calculus as an 11th grade student. And so I went to a guidance counselor and I told her my plans. And she said, forget that. You should go into physics, engineering, etc. And so I went into engineering when I went to Morehouse. I did some internships in engineering. Didn't like it very much in terms of the actual work. And I basically made a decision to switch. And so I eventually ended up switching to do something that was geared towards astronomy originally. And I graduated from Morehouse in 2006. I then moved to a small town in Texas named Brownsville, Texas. It's on the border of Texas and Mexico. They have a program there that does astronomy, physics sort of stuff there. And I was interested in the faculty there. So that's where I ended up. And this at this point is 2007. At this point, there was a large international mission that was being put together to discover what were known as gravitational waves. These were essentially waves that were being predicted by general relativity, Einstein's theory. And they had this huge, you can say, field experiment of sorts to try to actually measure them. And I was part of that particular big field experiment. And after 2 years of work, I kind of did the math in my head and was working with the data and realized this looks like a dead end field. And I need to figure out what to do because I now have a master's degree in something that probably isn't practical. So what I did from there was that I had some contacts associated with Colorado State University. And one of the things I thought about doing was to try to see how I can take my physics, math, and astronomy background and apply that to meteorology. And so Colorado State was looking for a physicist to work with hurricanes. And I was looking to apply my physics background to something that was more tangible, much better data you can work with, which was meteorology, was the field that I knew a good bit about. So I went to Colorado State. This is now 2008, 2009. Went there, loved my time in that area, got my PhD in atmospheric physics there. And that's how I kind of came into the field. So it meandered a good bit. So I went from kind of construction management to engineering to astronomy. And now I basically study the physics of hurricanes and other sort of large scale convective storms is what we would call it. So that's basically my academic journey in a nutshell.
So when did you get married in all this process?
Yeah, so that's fun. I got married in 2011. So this would have been about 3.5 years into my PhD program. So I met my wife while I was at Morehouse College. She was at the neighboring school named Spelman College. So right. This is now for the rest of the listeners. Morehouse College is a historically Black college. It's also an all-male college.
Correct.
But it sits right next door to an all-woman college named Spelman College. And so that meant, even though they're separate institutions, you see each other all the time. And it happened that my wife and I, we met going to church, essentially on a church bus. And that's basically how we met. So that would have been 2007 at that point. We were friends for a while. We basically started dating and courting around the 2009 time. So that would have been just after leaving Texas and then going to Colorado. And basically we got married in 2011. And that was about 3.5 years into my PhD program. So yeah, all of my major life events happened between 2010, 2012, where got married. We learned that my wife was pregnant. We had our first daughter. All that was basically in a 2-year period. And that also happened to be the time I was graduating from Colorado State. So I had to find a job, make sure my wife was okay, giving birth to a child. So the way this worked out in practice was I would come home, see how my wife is doing. She's pregnant, fly out to an interview, come back, check on my wife, see how she's doing, fly back out, and do this process about 65 times to find a job. And by the time our daughter was born, I was there for the birth. I had to leave 3 days later to go to my last interview. And that was how I went from Colorado to Louisiana. That was my first major academic job. And then I went from Louisiana to Charleston, and that's where I am now. So that would have been 2013 was when I got to the College of Charleston.
So, but the main point is your future wife kind of waited until she knew you had an actual, real, practical job that was going to work out before she married you. Is that?
Oh yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely. So I mean, I wouldn't blame her. That's what you're supposed to do.
My wife didn't. She married me when I just had a philosophy degree, so
okay.
And that wasn't going to be too beneficial. And then, so for some of the listeners, if they saw School Days, the movie by Spike Lee, right, that would have had both of those colleges in there. Is that correct?
Yeah, it was basically mimicking those colleges. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's what because was it set in Atlanta too? Do you know?
It was filmed on the campus of Morehouse and Spelman at the time, but I think they called it something different just to keep the movie fictional. But yeah, it was basically filmed there. That was also the time in which a lot of African Americans went back to historically Black colleges. So historically, you would have had in American history a large number of very high-ranking Black politicians coming from historically Black colleges back from the 1940s to the 60s. So that was the Martin Luther King Civil Rights era. When integration happened, integration basically caused a lot of African Americans to leave historically Black colleges, and they went to the major institutions. And so Spike Lee, he is a Morehouse graduate. He saw this. A lot of people saw that the historically Black colleges are being kind of left behind. And there was a deliberate push to bring them back to kind of Black visibility. So that's what the Cosby Show was about. If you remember the 80s, that's what the show, A Different World, which was a spinoff of the Cosby Show, School Days. So you had all those things that were surrounding historical Black colleges because the goal was to get the numbers back up and kind of show the importance of those colleges.
Sure. And so, I mean, we're kind of moving towards talking about race and racism and those kind of things that are going on in the world today this evening. Do you have any? Did you feel any? I don't know. Did you feel like it was more difficult or less difficult for you as you pursued higher degrees because you were African American? Did you see anything that stands out to you in any way?
No, not really.
That's good. That's good.
But I mean, that's not my experience, but
right.
I will say what I did notice, and this is primarily because of what historically Black colleges focus on. And so one of the main things that a historically Black college prides itself upon is mentorship. And so you step on campus and immediately you know that you're basically among a family. It's basically a fraternity within a fraternity. So at Morehouse College, for instance, there's a discussion on you are the talented 10%, meaning it's a reference to the old W.B. Du Bois book that's the top 10% African American population is going to help kind of lead it to the modern era. But you're the talented 10th, right? And the idea was this is a fraternity where we're meant to build your character. We're trying to make you statesmen and leaders and all those sort of things. So it's not like what goes on in a lot of predominantly white colleges where you kind of come in, you do your degree and you leave, and you don't really have any real association with the college. It's not just kind of come in and exit. It's an intentional, focused mentorship that happens for 4 years. And it also, what it does, it builds your confidence, builds your assertiveness, and all those other sort of intangible things that you expect.
Right.
So I went to an all-Black high school. I went to an all-Black college. So when I went to grad school, I was already assertive. I was already confident. I didn't have any sense of inferiority when it came to my peers around me. I knew I had a good education, and I knew that whatever gaps I had in my knowledge, I can pick up just as well as anyone else in my program. I did that from my master's program, and Colorado State is the top school in the country for atmospheric science. So when I walked there, I didn't have a sense of feeling that I'm ill prepared. I was prepared because I went to a good Black college. I had a focus about myself, and I knew that ultimately whether I rise or fall is going to be based upon the work I put in. So for me, I never felt any sort of, you can say, barriers put in front of me to progress further. That wasn't my experience. Right. What I did experience was a lot of people being surprised at basically how good I was at what I was doing. Mm. And that is one of the unfortunate after effects of the affirmative action era, where there's a sense in which if you went to college and you're Black sometime between 1970 and 1985, there's a sense that you yourself feel that you don't really deserve to be here. Not because you are inferior as a person, but because you don't have the same preparation, you don't have the same education, and you know that it is likely the case that you came into an institution with a lower sort of bar. That wasn't my issue at Colorado State. I had a master's degree already in physics. And so I was actually one of the top qualified candidates in my particular class because of my background. And for me, as a result, I never had that sort of inferiority that happened. So that's one of the issues that I talk about often with most people privately, is that when you talk about the barriers that you tend to see, often you will find there's a sense of inferiority some people feel because you may feel like you're the fish out of water. You weren't quite prepared for what is about to hit you. That was never my experience. I was trained well. I was well prepared. I knew to face these things head on. And I was just more irritated by the fact that people assumed I had a inferior background. That was more of an irritation, but that wasn't a barrier. I just went on my business and graduated. So in that sense, things are much better and much different than they were in the 70s, which have been my uncles and aunts and parents' generation, basically.
All right, I'm trying to formulate a question. And so, well, there's a lot there. The first thing I really thought of, just is just Chris Rock makes
Mm-hmm.
that point with Colin Powell. If you remember, I don't remember which special it was in, but it was back in the early 90s, just about Colin Powell speaking so well, everyone saying he spoke so well.
He's so articulate. Yeah.
And Chris Rock saying, what did you expect him to sound like? And so I know what you're saying, and I hear you. So you said in private conversations you have some of those kinds of discussions. How do you think? How does it work as far as Christianity? How did that affect maybe your outlook, I guess you would say? Because someone not being a Christian could definitely have a different outlook on some of these things than someone that is.
Definitely. And so my background in terms of my spiritual life is I grew up basically as a Pentecostal. That's kind of the family I grew up into. I rejected that wholesale by the time I was in high school, and I was basically an agnostic atheist. I, by the work of the Spirit and some good friends, and also my brother's witness, I came to Christ just after leaving high school around that time. And so when I entered college, I was trying to figure out a lot of this stuff kind of on the fly, in a sense, how to integrate faith in the Christian life. And one of the things I intentionally did at that time was to think about my life in terms of a ranking of priorities. So before I was a Christian, I essentially only thought about life in terms of work and financial success, which is why business kind of came to my mind originally. And that meant all of my life was essentially absorbed around those things. Now, what I realized is that when I became a Christian, now obviously that sort of mentality couldn't be there. And one of the things that gave me basically was, one, it gave me a sense of soberness because I knew I had to spend my time wisely. I still had to have some way of fashion trying to get about 80 to 90 hours a week of work done in some way of fashion. And I had to do that in such a way that I am not essentially absorbed completely with work. And so one of the things that I immediately did at that time was to understand the Christian Sabbath. And so what my actual undergrad life looked like was I had a work, worship, and rest sort of pattern going on. And it's one of the first things I basically developed. And one of the things that happens just in terms of my own development was that because the beginning of the week was spent in worship and not trying to finish off a whole bunch of stuff we didn't do last week, it basically meant that I had to see my work life as in some way or fashion being devoted to the Lord. Now, I didn't have all the categories there to put that out. But what I did understand at that time was if I'm going to do science, I cannot do science from the perspective that I'm trying to find my truth through science. That's not what I'm attempting to do through science. Rather, what I basically came to the conclusion is that when I'm doing my scientific work, scientific research, and etc., what I'm doing is discovering what God himself has already placed there or is sustaining actively in some way or fashion. And so I kind of took these scientific pursuits in a lot of the ways that people did before the Enlightenment. So think of Isaac Newton and his way of viewing his scientific endeavors. He viewed it primarily as a way to understand God's providence in a very clear and a very systematic, orderly sort of way. And then what I did is that as I went further in my education, I realized that when it comes to Christianity and science, if you look at the major scientific people before basically 1900, you would kind of see that almost all of them had a very distinct theological and devotional sense when they did work. And so an example would be Newton, but in the 19th century, we talk about people like Michael Faraday, who is, in today's language, he is probably the third most important scientist of the modern era because he's associated with the theories of electricity and magnetism. And when he talks about, when you read his biography, he goes into his lab, he goes before the Lord in prayer, asking the Lord to open his mind to behold wonderful things associated with, in this case, the scripture, or in his case, understanding God and nature. He goes about his actual work and journaling. He has kind of a prayerful interaction as he goes about his work. He instructs his students to practice integrity, because if you are going to be a scientist and you're going to serve the Lord, you must be above reproach. You cannot be someone who is fabricating data and kind of, in a sense, you can fabricate something in such a way as to make yourself popular and to make yourself important. Even if your research doesn't lead anywhere, you must, in a sense, maintain the integrity of actually keeping your records honest, keeping it well crafted. He then talks about at the end of his day, he thanks the Lord for the actual ability to think rightly about the world, to ponder these particular things, and also for being given the opportunity to study them, because in the 19th century, not everyone has enough peace to ponder creation and to think about scientific theories. And so that was what I started taking when I became a grad student, is that when you're involved in research, you can look at it either in terms of, I am creating new knowledge and making myself famous. You can think about it in that way. Or you can think of it in terms of the modern kind of climate science. I'm doing this research because I'm going to save the world in some way. Or you can look at this as, I'm doing scientific endeavors and research because I believe God is glorified when you study his works, whether that's works, whether you're talking about creation, providence, or etc. So that's, as I kind of got older, I started to see my work in that lens. So probably by the time I was a PhD student in Colorado, that's how I viewed research, and that's how I viewed scientific work. So as a result, I never really got burned out from doing research, because I didn't see this as my identity. It wasn't something that I was self-absorbed in. And at the same time, I knew I had to be very diligent, because this is essentially a stewardship. A lazy steward will be held into account. So there's a balance that goes there. And connected to kind of what you originally asked, one of the things that comes up when you talk to people about, they want to become a scientist, burning out is a very real experience for a lot of people, just because of the strain and stress that's put upon you by advisors and other sort of people around you. And then there's just the reality that you can become so absorbed with your research that nothing else in your life has any relevance, really. It's basically you're married to your work. And that's why, if you've ever kind of looked at statistics on scientists and academics in general, the greatest academics in the modern era today tend to have horrible family lives. They tend either to marry other scientists and academics, or they tend not to even think about their families. They tend to think of their families as playing second or third fiddle to the research endeavor. And as a Christian, you can't act in that way. You can't really have any position that says that I'm going to pursue selfish ambition to the extent of essentially removing family, removing God from your life. It's an impossibility for the Christian. And that means you have to approach it differently. And that's basically what I tried to do as I went through my PhD work. And also, that's one of the reasons I took this particular position, because if you think about the workload of an academic, if he's a good academic, if you go at a school that is a high-powered research institution, so think the MITs, Stanfords of the world, you're speaking about an 85-hour work week on average. If you think about that in practical terms, that means you're seeing your family on the weekend and you're basically in your lab. That's what you do in your life. Whereas I chose to have a position that allowed me to do research, but it also allowed me to actually have a life that is well formed outside of academia. And hence, these predominantly undergrad institutions kind of fit that sort of bill here.
So let me take you back to Atlanta real quick.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure.
So where were you going to church? Who were you being mentored by, maybe in a spiritual sense there in Atlanta?
Well, it wasn't good. I will tell you that up front. So,
Well, there's a
when
lot of
I,
churches in Atlanta and a lot of bad
yeah,
churches too. Yeah.
yeah. So when I was converted at the end of high school, I had no idea how to pick a church, and I had no real pastoral oversight. And so I ended up going to a very large mega church. It's called New Birth Missionary Baptist Church. It's a Word of Faith church, and it was led by the late Eddie Long. So
Oh,
basically, there's no oversight whatsoever. It's just kind of you come in, there's 15,000 people around you, and you exit. And so most of my time was spent bumbling through errors, trying to figure out what's going on with Word of Faith stuff, and also to kind of figure out basically how to read the Bible appropriately. And that kind of led me to being reformed afterwards. But for the first 3.5 years of my Christian life, that was my church experience. The next 4 years and change is basically trying to undo all of the bad Word of Faith stuff that happened. And then eventually, and this goes on all the way up into my PhD years, and I eventually joined pretty much a standard evangelical church in Colorado, where the church was focused primarily upon having shepherding care of the members. And that was the first church. But at that point, I was basically a Christian for 7.5, 8 years. And so I had very little mentorship up to that point. And it was at that church in which I basically was really shepherded and kind of fed the word at that point. So if I was just to boil that down, none of my early years in terms of church life I would recommend to anyone. It would say a lot of error, a lot of folly, a lot of youthful folly, and just dealing with the errors that propound themselves when you're trying to get rid of what I just call the self-absorbed Word of Faith life, which is basically what it is in a nutshell.
have you come into contact through literature or even in real life, I guess, and physically with like Michael Leach or Anthony Carter, Roger
Unfortunately,
Scovel?
I learned about all of these people after leaving Atlanta.
Yeah.
I learned about all of them, and I realized that particularly Michael Leach, his church was probably 10 to 15 minutes away from my actual home.
Wow.
So I learned that.
When did you
I learned that about
graduate
7 years after leaving.
when did you graduate from Morehouse?
I graduated in 2006.
Okay. Yeah.
And
So I was, as I told you, I was in Greenville, South Carolina from 2007. And I left Greenville 2011, 2012.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so there was a Stone Mountain, and I think it was called Reformed, but it's the Stone Mountain Reform Conference. It had a different name, and I was there for 2 years, but that would have been around 2009, 2010, maybe. But yeah, so they were there just in God's providence. You didn't come across them.
Never met them, never came across them. It's unfortunate, but God works in mysterious ways.
You might have been led down another path. That wasn't the path you were supposed to go. Mm-hmm. So you went from there to Texas. Mm-hmm. Where were you? What church did you have there in Texas? I'm just trying to ferret all this out now.
No, that's fine. I didn't have a church in Texas actually for 2 years. It turned out that the city I was in had only two types of churches. It had Roman Catholic churches because it's next to Mexico, and a lot of Word of Faith Pentecostal.
That's a pretty rough town down there.
Yeah, I was dead set against Word of Faith, and I knew I was a Roman Catholic. But in terms of my own journey, it was the Roman Catholic churches there and their apologists that actually led me to being reformed. They would basically approach me with a bunch of questions on scripture and sola fide, etc. And then at the time, I hadn't heard of the actual language. I knew the concepts. And I realized that growing up as a Pentecostal, there was a little bit too much similarity I started to experience with the Roman Catholics, particularly on salvation. And also just in terms of, I guess, spiritual disciplines, the sort of mystical ways that Roman Catholic spirituality can be is similar to Pentecostal spirituality. But one of the things that was fascinating was that the Roman Catholic apologists were so certain of their position. They told me to read Luther's Bondage of the Will. They were certain that if I read that, I would basically come to their position. And it basically, that set me against it completely. And that was the book that changed my trajectory, basically, because once they gave me about Bondage of the Will, then I at that time went online to look at other Lutheran sort of stuff. And then I just stumbled upon Ligonier Ministries, and that's kind of where I ended up going, basically. But yeah, so in Texas, there was nothing that I knew anything close to all those things. I knew my soul would be in danger if I went to the Roman Catholic Church. I knew that for certain after the Bonds of the Will. And then I also knew that to go back to the Word of Faith was probably worse than going to a church at that point, because it wasn't really a church there. So I basically watched a bunch of churches online at that point, and the only church that I knew of that was solid was Voddie Baucham's church in Houston. And that's the church I was basically watching. But Houston and Brownsville are many hours apart. I think it's at least, let's see, maybe 6 hours, 7 hours apart. So there's no way for me to go there, something like that. So that was my thought. And yeah, from there, listen to Voddie. And then Voddie introduced me to James White. And then kind of from there, I ended up being Reformed Baptist.
Yeah. Although you call yourself a particular Baptist, I think on your, which I appreciate. That shows that you've really thought through the process.
That's correct. I also know that most people don't know what a particular Baptist is until you're Reformed Baptist. Yeah. And I don't feel like fighting with the people who agree with R. Scott Clark on this topic, like whatever. Right. You can take the Reform label. I don't care. Yeah, I'm fine. As long as you don't think I'm a Armenian Southern Baptist, I'm okay. That's basically
this is a little bit of a side note, but I think it's funny because my kind of thing is, if you're confessional, right, you get to hold the Reformed title, right? If you're non-confessional, then you got to go over there and start calling yourself a particular. And so, I mean, I don't think I'm 100% down the line with R. Scott Clark, but I kind of have sympathies towards what he says. But yeah, it's like, if you're going to say I hold to the London Baptist Confession, then all right, you can be Reformed if you're confessional. But again, I think it just becomes more of a personal way of us kind of figuring it out. Although I do think at some point it would be nice if we had, the nomenclature so that we could all, and people not take it as an insult, to say, well, you're this or you're that. That way we have a starting point. Well, I know where you are. You're confessional, you're not confessional, that kind of thing. So
that's true. I'm not gonna go on that tangent, but that's true. But it was given to it was, as I understand it. The reason it became offensive is because the other alternative was Anabaptist, and that's clearly offensive, right? To call particular Baptist Anabaptist is
I mean, if you say you're Reformed Baptist, I think it's awesome, because I mean, and then I know you're confessional, then we can go straight to the London Baptist Confession. So that's anyway, that we don't want to get on that rabbit trail, but I enjoy those discussions if people can have them. A lot of people can't have them. So you went from Texas to Colorado.
Yes.
And in Colorado, did you find a Reformed or particular church you could go to?
I did eventually, and that took a couple of years to find, but so there's a church up. So Colorado State is in Fort Collins, Colorado. So that's northern Colorado, about an hour from the border. And there's basically one big Reformed Baptist like church there called Reformed Baptist Church of Northern Colorado, basically. Yeah. And so that was a church that I became really interested in looking at the time. But in terms of my own kind of journey to all these things, the church that was actually the first real Reformed Presbyterian church I ended up joining is when I moved to Louisiana to get my first job. We joined a EPC church, actually, in Monroe, Louisiana. The reason why is because in Monroe, Louisiana, this is now 2012, around this time. This was the Auburn Avenue controversy. And that's right in Monroe, apparently, which I didn't know about at the time. And there was a big mass exodus of people from the Auburn Avenue church, and they went to this conservative EPC church called Covenant Presbyterian. And that's really the first real Reformed Presbyterian church in which I kind of got, I guess, in my thinking, it's a full Reformed kind of liturgy, full Reformed in terms of its view of church polity, things of that nature. So, yeah. So I would say that in a nutshell, a lot of journeying through churches, and I eventually settled into a good Reformed church at the time that my family and I moved to Louisiana for my first academic job.
And so, without putting you on the spot, then, so in Charleston, I'm going to assume from our discussion before we went live that there's not a Reformed Baptist church in that area.
Yeah, none that I'm aware of. And what I've been told is from other people is that there have been a number of failed church plants of Reformed Baptist churches in Charleston. And for that reason, I've been happily being a member of Christ Church Presbyterian. It's a PCA church. It was basically a church plant in 2013, which is around the time I got to Charleston. And again, we had our debates on baptism and polity and all that sort of stuff. But no, we love each other. These are brothers in the Lord that I love dearly. And they've been with me and my family through all of our various kind of family challenges that have happened since moving to Charleston. And so, we love each other. We're well planted in the church, well established, and glad to see the Lord doing his work, at least in Charleston in the church.
Well, yeah, that's good. I didn't realize that the PCA had shown up in 2013 in Charleston. There's a PCA church up in Myrtle Beach.
There are other PCA churches in the Charleston area. So there have been, at the time that Christ Church came, I believe there were 4 in the general area. So if you think of Charleston, you have downtown Charleston, then you have west of the peninsula, which is called West Ashley. East of the peninsula is called the Mount Pleasant area. Then you had North Charleston, and then the outer regions. And so there were churches basically in West Ashley, the west of the peninsula, that had been there for at least 35 years. There was a church north of the peninsula, and there was a church somewhere downtown that was PCA, as I remember correctly. But for various different reasons, we could, in terms of where we lived, the church west of the Ashley was about 40 minutes from where we were, in terms of from our house to that particular church. And also the one that was downtown at the time, we kind of were looking for a more conservative PCA church than the one that was downtown. And then that's when Christ Church came and did a plant east of the peninsula in Mount Pleasant. And that's where we've been since then. There's also some ARP churches in the area, but I knew nothing about ARP when I first got to Charleston.
And that's okay. And Erskine College is somewhere there in South Carolina too, but that's the other side of the state, right? You guys are you guys technically in the low country there, or are you?
Yeah, we're officially still low country. If you are basically south of Highway 526, then you're low country people in the sense.
And you're in Hurricane Alley, so that's good for your job.
Yeah. Exactly.
So I really don't even want to start talking about race.
Oh yeah, I mean, it's fine.
Going to. So I in general, how is it in Charleston? I mean, I don't remember. Well, let me say this because I didn't. So I don't know if you know exactly where I'm at in Nebraska, but I'm on the western side of the state, as I said. But I mean, I think we're 2.5 hours from Fort Collins. I mean,
Oh, okay.
Denver's where we go if we want to. I mean, Cheyenne we can go to. We're like an hour. I don't know how far we are from Cheyenne, Wyoming, but that's along the way. But it's not a very big town either. Fort Collins is probably bigger than Cheyenne is.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So yeah, and I have a stint in my heart that got there a couple of years ago. That was done in Fort Collins, so I'm familiar with Fort Collins and their medical facilities.
Okay.
Yeah, flown there in a helicopter, so that was fun. But I know a little bit about the area that you were in. That's why I was asking about what church you might have been at.
Mm-hmm.
So there in Charleston, we don't have I said all that to say first, we don't have a very large African American population in Western Nebraska.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know what it was like in Fort Collins. But in Charleston, I don't remember. Of course, I know you have an African American community there. How large a community do you have? Has there been issues there, like we've seen across the country, in larger cities, I guess?
Yeah, sure. We can if you think about Charleston, this is one of the most historic parts of the South. Charleston was a major slave trade port city. I think it was the first major one to the South, which means there's a long history of the African American slave trade's influence upon Charleston's economy in the antebellum South as well. And also, Charleston also has a connection to Barbados. Barbados isn't that far from Charleston itself, and that connection basically means that Charleston looks a lot like Barbados. Barbados looks a lot like Charleston. There was an interchange of sugar and also slaves going back and forth. And what that has produced is a number of different kind of regional effects. And so Charleston has at least Black Charleston culture has what is called a Gullah Geechee sort of feel to it. And the Gullah Geechee people are essentially descendants of Africans who were originally on the exterior islands, and they were the ones who basically came in to work on the rice plantations that were in the immediate low country. And so that actual community still exists in the south of Charleston area near the islands. So you have kind of a indigenous African sort of culture. You did have all of the consequences that happened with the Civil War and how the Reconstruction South changed in a lot of ways. That culture is still around in some way or fashion. And then if you just think about the New South means people like me, Northerners, have come to move into the South, and we bring our own kind of customs and cultures with it. So Charleston, in that sense, has become pretty eclectic in terms of the ways in which people interact. In terms of the actual, I guess, racial unrest that may happen in Charleston, as I mentioned, I got here in 2013. In 2015, that was the Emmanuel 9 shooting that happened, where Dylan Roof came into a historic African-American church and killed 9 people in the church. He was an actual white supremacist, meaning he had swastikas on and he was trying to sort of race war. And one of the more pleasant things I experienced in Charleston was seeing what happened after that event. After that event, instead of having kind of, you can say, hostilities develop between whites and blacks in Charleston, the opposite happened. What you saw immediately following the Emmanuel 9 shooting was a very strong togetherness among the actual black and white population in Charleston. And you saw a lot of white churches and black churches supporting one another at that time, because they basically realized, those who are in kind of lived in Charleston their entire lives, is that they did not want Charleston to become like Baltimore and other places in which a racial situation produces this huge racial storm. And that was basically my first experience here when it came to potential racial unrest, was that sort of situation. So Charleston is not like a lot of other cities in the South. Most other cities, there's a very tangible feel to previous racial injustices. Charleston, it seems that that situation has been improved dramatically. It's still there in different ways, but when it comes to the sort of hostility that bubbles to the surface, that's not the Charleston that I've experienced since being here. The next thing that happened that brought controversy was, I think this is now 2018, was the Walter Scott shooting, where the basic story, you can look this up online. Walter Scott was shot in the back by a police officer. It happened that shooting occurred about 5 or 10 minutes away from my apartment complex at the time. So it was big public news, and same sort of thing happened. There was kind of a tension there because there were some who were basically making a statement that no person should be shot in the back for any particular reason. And then you had those who were in some way trying to have an explanation for the cop's behavior. You saw a little tension, but again, it never rose to a sense in which you have big picture hostility. Largely speaking, the community was more or less united in how that whole situation went down. It didn't lead to a lot of racial unrest among the people in the town. It just kind of went its course. The case went forward. The police officer went to jail for it. Was being charged. I forget the exact charge that he was given, but it's at least a 20-year sentence attached to the actual particular case. So again, not the same sort of thing that happened in the Freddie Gray case and the Trayvon Martin case, not that sort of hostility that arose. And so that's basically been my experience in Charleston. The most surprising thing that's happened was this year when the actual George Floyd shooting occurred. When it came to how the actual protest happened in Charleston, and it's like a lot of cities in this sense. In the daytime, there was large peaceful protests, black, white together, protesting what had happened. And in the daytime, you probably had thousands of people marching in the streets downtown for George Floyd. You had probably other hundreds of people marching on bridges, things of that nature. Very peaceful. It was so peaceful that you had mothers bringing their children in strollers with the peaceful protests. It was one of those sort of, it's what you expected Charleston to be like, commonality between people. Unfortunately, what happened was that the daytime protest finished off at a certain time, and then there was another protest that happened at night. And this is what we've all seen in the country, where mysterious people that none of us has ever seen before appear in black masks, and now they are smashing buildings and things of that nature. And there was a shock and awe that happened to a lot of people. Like Charleston didn't even respond like this in the Walter Scott case, and it didn't respond like this in the Dylan Roof case of the Manual 9. So there was a shock and awe that, one, people are apparently are looting and breaking private property and now rioting and looting in this case. And then secondly, what was surprising is that it appeared from a lot of people that the police just kind of stood back and watched it happen. A lot of confusion that went on. And that was probably the greatest racial hostility I've seen since being in Charleston, because you had on one side a number of people who would say it is completely wrong in any way or fashion to riot and loot to destroy people's property. It's not only wrong, it's counterproductive. It basically destroys the entire momentum of the protest. There was that crowd of people. And then the other crowd of people are people who are misquoting Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, who say that riots are the language of the unheard. People making claims that you care more about people's buildings being destroyed than black lives being killed. That was the first time I saw anything like that in Charleston. And so I was stunned by it, basically, to be honest. I expected that in the other places I've been. So in Atlanta, for instance, Atlanta's rioting, looting, setting on fire. That's kind of what I expected to happen in Atlanta. I did not expect that to happen in Charleston. And it was to me just a shocking and awful picture to see. And so in terms of what does this mean for the future in Charleston, my hope is that this is one of those situations in where Charlestonians will do what they have done the previous 6 years I've been here, that there's angst, but we seem to come to a common consensus at some point. And that's basically what's, at least on my end, what's going on. And when I wrote a little article about this, that's what I really wanted to focus on, is that there is a lot of rioting and looting in a whole bunch of different cities, but we all know the actual places we live. We know our neighbors. We know that these events should not bring suspicion upon our neighbors who we already know, which is one of the things that was happening in other cities, that you have the situation where you ask someone, what side are you on? And I'm not on any particular side. You're my neighbor. I'm going like, I live next to you. I know you. I'm going to defend you and love you before I defend people who live in distant cities. And that's kind of the sense in which I learned that mainly from Charleston endeavors, is that before we even get into the nitty-gritty issues on public policy, there's the reality that you have to at some point realize that the people who live next to you are real people. They're not just social media. It's not just the imaginary people on social media. These are real people with real issues that are more complex than just simply saying, what side are you on? The protesters or the police or something of that nature. And so that has been, in my sense, what a lot of the recent events has done, is kind of produce a splintering that I haven't seen before in Charleston.
So you mentioned, and I'm trying to pull it up, you mentioned this article that you wrote, and you came out June 3rd. Does that sound right?
Yes. Yeah, sounds about right.
I'm almost there. There we go.
Yeah, June 3rd. Mm-hmm.
Just so people can see. There it is. Is there anything in here that you would like to point out of significance? I know there was some pushback in the comments, I think.
Yeah. I mean, there's always going to be pushback.
Well, of course, yeah. Well, that's good that there's pushback. That means people are reading your article, right?
Yeah, exactly. So a couple of things I think are just worth emphasizing is I spent a lot of time talking about the media in this article, and to your local media, I'm talking about the national media, the national MSNBC, CNN, Fox, etc. And one of the things that I think is important to remember is that their motives and their intentions are different in your own and your local community. Their motive and intention is not merely to just report factual information. Their intention is that they're a business. They have to attract people to their actual either web pages or their actual TV in order to make money for their station. So that means they have a particular financial benefit towards either inciting more controversy. They have a financial benefit in some way or fashion to exaggerate certain parts and to leave out other parts to these stories. And so one of the examples I give, and this is something that most people know if you kind of followed the police brutality discussion over the last 5 to 10 years, is that the national media has a way of focusing almost solely upon the racial aspects of police brutality. And that has given the impression to a lot of people, for good or for bad, that police brutality is driven largely by racial issues that are there. And one of the things I mentioned in this article is that, no, that's not actually true. Statistically, it is the case that there are more interactions of police with Black people in this country. And that in some way is expected because there is a disproportionate amount of crime committed by certain portions of the Black population. But the reality is that there's a lot of gory, brutal cases that have never really made the national media. And that's primarily because they don't have the same sort of racial controversy attached to it. And so I gave a couple examples in the article itself. So, for example, when it comes to the national media's coverage, everyone knows the Eric Garner case. Everyone knows the Michael Brown case because of the, hands up, don't shoot. Everyone knows the Freddie Gray case. And if you live in Charleston, you know the Walter Scott case. But if you kind of think about the rest of what goes on, very few people know today about the Daniel Shaver case, in which you had a man in his living room holding his hands up, begging not to shoot, and a police officer is basically bearing down upon him and basically shoots him in his own house. Again, it's a gory story that was recorded because it was on a body cam, and it received a lot of grassroots sort of attention, but it didn't have the same national media attention. And you can take that as you will. If you follow these police brutality cases, that's a very well-known case. If you don't follow police brutality cases, that's something that you probably didn't really see much, basically. Then one of the other things I mentioned is when we talk about police brutality, there is a large amount of literature on a topic on actual solutions to police brutality. And one of the things that the national media has chosen to ignore is the fact that these things do exist. So on the actual screen, there's a Twitter thread that gives you a long series of research-based solutions to police brutality for different areas. It shows you how these have been implemented locally and how these have had positive and negative effects in terms of, does it actually lower the actual homicide rate or actually keep it basically the same? These are things that have actually been well established if you actually follow this sort of thing. But again, for the national media, this isn't something that is particularly important. And that means if you are paying attention basically to the national media, it has a way of kind of inciting a lot of anger inside of a lot of people. It also means it incites a situation in which African Americans and white people think that they are disagreeing with one another a lot. The reality is that most of the things that we talk about concerning police brutality, everyone agrees with. So, for example, the whole defund the police thing that's been going on, Black and white people agree that that's a stupid idea. Now, you don't get that impression if all you're doing is looking at the very loud Black Lives Matter people on one side and basically the people on the other side who have a kind of a blind allegiance to the police. You don't really get that in either case. You don't really get to see how much agreement we actually have on these things. That's why when the Breonna Taylor case happened and there was this whole controversy on why do we have no-knock warrants, if you look at the actual survey data, the polling data, Black and white people agree that should stop. That's why the city of Louisville made a law to stop that, because it's not something that's controversial. We actually agree on those things. But the national media portrays this as saying Black people want to end the no-knock warrants and white people are generally ambivalent. That's not the actual reality of what we see. And then you can kind of go down and have a whole bunch of other cases. But that's the first thing I've always wanted to kind of point at is much of the racial hostility that happens is largely artificial when you talk to real people. One of the things that you realize that when you sit down, you talk to people, and usually this means your neighbors, you realize, yeah, we have some disagreements, but we actually agree on a whole lot. We agree that there are ways to deal with policing that involves de-escalation. That's actually not remotely controversial anymore. A lot of people agree with that. When it comes to dealing with issues on taking kind of the militarized police and kind of scaling it down, yeah, actually, most Americans agree with that. There's a lot of people who believe that the local police forces should not look like former Army vets, basically. That's something that's not controversial to most people. But it's not the trend of national media to actually report how we agree, which means how we can move forward. It is the trend of national media to look at the black and white differences that exist between people. And one of the things I want to kind of assert is if that is kind of if that's what you're seeing in terms of all these cases, then it's probably the case you're being emotionally manipulated in some way. Whether you're emotionally manipulated to be angry at a certain group of people, or you're emotionally manipulated to think that there's this situation in which black people are being hunted like prey in the woods. If that's kind of how you view things in terms of what you're seeing from national media, it's clear you're being emotionally manipulated in the process. Well, so that's kind of my first.
Yeah, and I think that's really a big part of the issue too. And I don't know who first reported it. I don't know how it first came out, but in the George Floyd case, and I've maintained this from the beginning, and this is how for me, this is how we have to get past some of the issues that we're in. We can't say that was a racially motivated murder.
Yep.
I can't think of the officer's name until we have some evidence that it was racially motivated. I mean, number one, that guy could have just been a jerk. He could have been a jerk, 6 days out of the week. And it just so happens that the guy that he was being a jerk to at this point was African-American, and he went too far. But it could have just as well been a white American, a Caucasian, as it was George Floyd. And again, there might be something I don't know, so don't send hate mail to me. But just from the bare facts of it, until we know that the man was motivated by a racial issue, we can't say that this particular case was racially motivated. Now, I understand there's angst about, the many cases that happened before, but I think until we have to look at these things as case-by-case basis. And again, I think, like you said, we would all agree that was way too much restraint to have his knee on his neck for over 8 minutes. But again, I think that to stand up and, make this a hate crime or whatever based upon race, I think we jumped the gun, and I think we're not looking, it's not just, as Christians, we want to look for justice in all things, and we want justice in that case, and we want this man to be tried and found guilty of what he's guilty of. But to get into the motive of why he did it, we need to talk to the man and find out if it was actually racially motivated, or as if they're saying now they actually knew each other. There could have been some issue there just because they knew each other. I don't know. Do you have any thoughts on that? Are you disagreements or?
No, I mean, our starting point is often wrong in these discussions. So the starting point often is if it's a white cop and a black person, the starting point is it looks like this is racially motivated. The starting point is wrong. And that's the problem with most hate crime scenarios, is that you assume a hate crime happens until you have to disprove it. It's actually the opposite. You should be doing the other way around.
Right.
And so an example of this would be just before the George Floyd case, we had the Ahmaud Arbery case,
right,
where it appears that's what happened in that story. And again, the way that the media works, you get information in piecemeal. You never get the full story at any point in time until after it all kind of settles down. But that's a case where you had an awful looking video and more information came out, and it looks like the two white men who were apparently pursuing Arbery may have actually had a racial animus, because they basically yelled a racial epithet at him after they killed him.
Right.
That looks, you only learn that after investigation has happened. And this is the wisdom of this is the wisdom of being cautious about your proclamations before you know you have enough evidence around to make that statement. And so to go back to the George Floyd case, when it first came out, what I saw from a number of different kind of online sites, and then MSNBC reported, was that Derek Chauvin, a white cop, controversially kills George Floyd, a black man. Now, I know exactly what you're trying to do there. I mean, common sense says if this was a white guy and a white guy, you would not say a white man killed a white man. You would not say a black man killed a black man. You only make that statement because you are poisoning the well. You are making a statement that you want the people to review this to say, this possibly is racially motivated. And then if you start that with your head and then you see the 8-minute video, oh, now you're certain it's racially motivated at this point. But you already had the well poisoned. There's no way that that can be disproved at this point if you started with that assumption. And that to me is the main issue with that particular case, is that immediately as soon as the George Floyd situation happened, the video was released, and then there was a lag time between when the cop was actually arrested and given charges. The immediate thing was Black Lives Matter. And that gives the impression that we are all interpreting this as racially motivated. That is the assumption by saying Black Lives Matter, say his name, etc. Otherwise, you would just say, that's police brutality. That person should get charged with it. You wouldn't say, this is now a black-white situation in which we not need to mobilize the nation and protest to treat black people better. The only reason you do that is because you assumed, based upon how it was given to you and based upon how social media crafts stories, that this has started to be racially motivated. And that's why even around the country, you have people thinking that this is not merely a bad police officer in a police brutality case. This is nationally seen as a situation where racial issues has risen to the surface. Now, we now have more evidence to show at this point that the officer had already had prior infractions of conduct before the case. We now know that, which means he's been basically doing jerky things to people for a while. And he kind of, he didn't quite get a slap on the wrist, but what actually happens is that he wasn't taken off the force, which means you have a person that has a history of brutality and inappropriate behavior on the police force. And now this now becomes a black person that you're dealing with, that you killed under your watch. So that is the main difference that's happening here. And yeah, so kind of going back to what you said here, the immediate jump to think this is racial, I don't personally think that's accidental by the media. I think that's the intended meaning of how they framed the story when it first came out. You have to work very hard to prove it otherwise at this point. And to me, that's the recipe for inciting racial problems among people for no good reason, apart from just you emotionally stirred up about a situation that happened. So
let me ask the $1 million question,
sure.
Which $1 million is not that much, $1 billion question maybe. I mean, so what in the world can we do so that people and are better informed? I mean, again, I think right now the biggest problem, what you're saying is like we can't really trust the media. This has happened in my lifetime. It's probably happened in your lifetime. I think it's because of the 24-hour news cycle. There was a little bit more integrity when you just had the nightly news, and they were paid kind of out of a different well of money, from my understanding. And so there was a little bit more integrity. Once, CNN showed up, then Fox and all these other ones, then it's on. We're all, up for, it's just a business. Like you're saying, it's just a business, and we need to draw an audience, and whatever is going to draw the best audience. Again, it's not even news anymore. It's a 24-hour opinion piece on the news more than it is even the news. And so exactly. we can't really trust what they're saying. So, I mean, I'm at a loss. That's why I'm having this conversation with you as well. What do we even do to begin to try to get people to come at a case like George Floyd and go, hey, just wait till we get some more evidence? Now, again, what they took a couple of days to actually even arrest him or something. So
Yeah.
there's some problems there too. But
Yeah.
as far as what I can see, I don't know all the facts, the ins and outs, but how do we get people to go, let's just wait and hold off and not rush to judgment? Again, that's a biblical concept. You brought it up too. You know, it's one man's testimony seems right in our eyes till another one comes along. But so what do we do? I'm asking you to solve all our world's problems now.
Apparently, there's a number of things that can be done, and this is what I tell people locally. First, I am personally of the belief that a person should not get their news solely from national media. Right. One. And I'm also of the belief that a person should be relentlessly local when they think about their news. And the reason I come to that conclusion is because I want people to be much more engaged and passionate about things they actually have a sphere of influence over. So an example would be the George Floyd case. As much as horrible it is to watch a man die in an 8-minute video, the question that you yourself have to ask would be, one, why are you watching this video? In terms of just how does this actually help you personally assess the story? But two, I would just want the person to ask themselves the question just privately, what could you actually do about that situation? Because often the answer is nothing but anger. That's usually the answer. Whereas when it came, I'll take the Charleston example. When it came to the Walter Scott case, and I'm actually a Charleston resident, I live near this area, there's actually a lot that you can do locally to kind of understand, in a sense, what's going on. How does the actual police proceedings go in your particular area? And that means you'll be much more concerned about getting the the actual facts of the matter correct in your local particular area. You're much more concerned about how this should be played out in your local area. So when it comes to, for instance, the Walter Scott case, what's just as important as finding out what actually happened on the tape is basically trying to determine whether or not this is going to lead to, again, what we're seeing now. Rioting, looting, and etc. And that means you have other things that you need to be concerned about more than just the kind of factual matter of the case. What are you actually doing in a just kind of a simple wisdom case in some way or fashion to actually keep your actual neighborhood, keep the people you know kind of on the ball because it's a local particular issue? My expectation is that in the George Floyd case, people in Minneapolis would have been outraged at what happened, and they would have petitioned their city council to fix this problem. And that is not what has happened. What has happened is that all these outside people are basically plugging their opinions into local issues. And now the local city council is basically hearing a bunch of voices outside the community, and now they're making irrational decisions, such as get rid of the police. It would be one example of this. Same sort of thing I would say here is that as much as that we all like to be kind of on par with what's going on nationally, you always have to ask yourself, what are you called to do? What is your sphere of influence? Often the case is most of these things happen so far away from you that the best you can do is to call someone up who lives in that area, if you happen to know someone, to ask them what is actually going on, because the local media has more voices and eyes on the ground than the national media does. Ask someone what's actually happening. Ask them how we can pray for them. Ask them how we can support them. Those are the sort of things that themselves actually matter. So I'm very much a relentlessly local sort of person. If you handle your local affairs properly and you focus upon what you actually have a sphere of influence on, it lessens the likelihood of you trying to essentially practice zeal without any sort of proper judgment. That's my first thing I would say. Second thing I would say here is to be aware of, well, what's the nice way to say it? Be aware of being played by a bunch of people. And what I mean by this is that in every tragedy that happens, doesn't matter how it occurs naturally, there are always opportunists. And an opportunist is a person who will take your emotional distress and manipulate it for you to do their bidding. And so one of the reasons I am very much opposed to the Black Lives Matter movement is because this is one of the things they do frequently. Is that they take a case like George Floyd, and now all of a sudden we have a national campaign to remove George Washington, Thomas Jefferson statues and deface the various national memorials. And the reality is, what has happened is that they have taken your emotional anger and they have now used it for their own purposes. Realize that's what always happens in national stories. And it's not just a black-white thing. Whenever there's a national controversy, there are always those who want to manipulate or take your emotion and manipulate it to their particular goals. And that means it's not only that you have to be careful about essentially believing the first thing that you see, you also have to be careful of how you feel as soon as you experience something. Often what happens is that your gut feelings are not biblically informed. They're not wise. They're not actually grounded in anything. They're actually just an emotional tug to make you do something that sound wisdom would tell you should refrain from doing. And that's always the warning I give other people. And then my third thing, and let
me jump in real quick before you go to the third thing, just because, so like we have this, in Seattle, we have this autonomous zone, right?
Yeah.
And that's opportunists in my mind. It's what in the world does that have to do with anything? You know what I mean? Like, it's almost an insult. I mean, I want to be African American so I can go holler and go, what in the world, are you doing? This has got nothing to do with anything. And again, maybe they have some manifesto that I don't know about that they wrote, but it's like, I don't understand what in the world it's got to do with anything. I mean,
well, there's, we can get into a little more kind of like, old politics here, but we have a good long history of how communism works in terms of the grassroots side of it. That what we know from history is that communists have often used the racial animus between people to assert their agenda. This is not the first time this has happened, and it's not going to be the last time. And so an example would be here. When you know that you have a bunch of people who are angry and following the mob, you can get away with a whole bunch of stuff. That means you have a ripe environment for anarchist communists and a bunch of other what the Bible will call worthless men rising up to essentially assert themselves. And that's just the reality of what opportunism is about. And that's why I would say right now, so many people are angry or guilty about something that they don't see what's obvious and clear. None of this has anything to do with these cases.
Well, and I guess, but I mean, are they? Because I mean, I don't. Again, I'm all for peace, but I mean, it seems like we should be putting a stop to this. It seems like that local government should be going, no. I mean, this is complete chaos. It's completely illegal. I mean, I don't even understand how it's being allowed, other than they don't want to escalate things. But I just
part of it. That's part of it, but you also should just remember, the golden rule of American democracy in terms of politics is that if an action that you perform will get you unelected, you just won't do it.
Right.
Period. And so cowardice is we see a lot of cowardice around the country. And Chaz is one example, the autonomous zone, but when I look at this, I think of all of these statues that have been defaced. And I think to myself and say, are you, think of a Congress, think of a governor or a local mayor. It's very easy to essentially allow them to vandalize it, and then you clean it later on and get it back to its original condition. That's one way to kind of weasel off a problem, right? But the reality is that we don't have statesmen anymore in our political culture. We have politicians. We have slimy, opportunistic, and short-sighted politicians who are trying to keep their particular jobs. And that means when it comes down to their election and your safety and your town, we know what they will often choose. And so if you look at Seattle, for instance, we all know that Seattle is not a center-left place. It's far left. Now, most people aren't at the point of the autonomous zone, but do you really want to be a Seattle mayor or a state official that agrees with Trump that this should be squashed? No. So you will pretend that this is a big block party, and the block party will go on indefinitely, instead of realizing that you have potential rapes, murder, and all sorts of things that normal people will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law if they did it. The reason you're not doing it is because you're opportunist. You feel that this will actually give you more credence when you come up for election. But it does mean there is cowardice.
And from what I understand, any place that this is happening, any place where there's an autonomous zone, where there's kind of free reign to commit acts of violence or crime, they're progressive, liberally run communities.
For the most part.
Yeah, conservative communities are not allowing these kinds of things to happen for the most part. So I do think that feeds into it. That's all I'm going to say about that for now. But yeah, you had a third. Yeah,
third point is it's really just a plea at this point. And one of the things I've been enraged about is that many people have lost their common moral decency and sense, right? And one of the things that this current moment has kind of shown in some way or fashion is that for a lot of people, the worst thing to be called is a racist, because apparently to be called a racist means you will not call animal barbarism what it is. When you have people going into stores, looting, and then pushing over elderly people to loot, that's not just the voice of the unheard. That is a mob of violent criminals moving into a particular area. When you have mobs of people throwing rocks at a children's hospital while they loot, those are not just people who are not heard. Those are morally degenerate people. And the reality is that most of what we're seeing today is happening because there's a sense in which that common moral decency is being explained away because you don't want to be called a racist. And this is something I learned from a older black man. And this is a man who went through the affirmative action era of the 70s. And he said it pretty bluntly. If you cannot tell someone that they're wrong, or if you cannot critique someone, that means you don't see them as your equal. You see them as someone needs to be pacified. And one of the things I want to just kind of tell people is just because someone is black doesn't mean that they have a moral high ground that you don't have. The reality is that a lot of what's going on that we see that is criminal deviancy among a certain small section of the black population needs to be called for what it is. If you see these people, if you see us as being equal to you, that means you should be able to go man to man and say, stop the foolishness, stop the violence, because this is what's going on. We have a situation where we have a large number of people turning a blind eye to something because they don't want to kind of be heard that they are possibly a racist. The reality is that that's going to happen regardless. You're going to be called all sorts of things by people because you're going to stand up to them. But the way that we actually show in a real society that we actually view each other as equals is that we should be able to say confidently that you're wrong about something. I can show you why. We should be able to have a man-to-man conversation about what's actually happening. And for my own personal kind of personal intuition or just disposition, I'm appalled at what people of my skin color are doing in certain areas. And I've been very harsh about it publicly. And I think oftentimes it feels as if there's people who agree with me, but they probably don't want to say it because they know the backlash they will get versus what I would get is different, basically. But we're dealing with a situation where we have allowed, and again, not every place this is happening, that's clear. But we have a situation where in major cities across the country, we have people committing acts of vandalism and violence and are unchecked because the belief is they are somehow a little more noble than you in some way or fashion. And I find this distasteful. I find it disrespectful. It's something that if I did this and my grandfather knew, he would call it everything I just did to be shameful. You are erasing the work of a whole generation of people by acting this way. And I would say this to those who are not Black. If you feel that there's a white person, you observe this, you're basically watching your own communities, your own cities being torn down. And you know that the politicians in your cities aren't doing anything about it. And they will likely continue to kind of sit back and let it happen in hopes that it will just kind of, the mob will kind of ease and become pacified. The reality is that just like it would be shameful for me to do it, and my father and grandfather would say that, you should be able to say that confidently. And you should say that confidently because these are your areas if you live in these particular places. And so in terms of not being manipulated by all that's going on, what I want you to realize is that if you are being manipulated in different ways, my whole appeal to you is that remember the common sense you were given, that injustice and all these other things does not erase the moral character that a person should have. There are certain behaviors that should be thought as being unacceptable, full stop, regardless of who commits them. There should be a certain standard of what it means to be a human. There should be a certain standard of what it means to be an American, full stop. And particularly if you're a Christian, to justify any of this by saying, well, destroying property is less important than destroying human life. Any justification means that you have lowered yourself. You have now lost the actual moral authority to speak about anything if you actually allow such behavior to go on unchecked. And that's just my kind of personal appeal to people, is that I have my sphere of influence. It's small, but most of you have your own sphere of influence in your local areas. Take advantage of the fact that you can speak directly about this and realize that to be silent about things that you know directly affect your community is going to have consequences that are irreversible, period. And so at the end of the day, when it comes to looking at these kind of situations, you have to ask yourself the question, are we actually adult enough to actually address these issues man to man in a straightforward way? And can we actually talk? And this is what it means in my mind to love your neighbor and to respect your neighbor. You should be able to have this discussion and not be afraid that you're going to offend someone. I mean, distinct between us in this conversation, that it would be somewhat shameful to basically have the view that I can't really ask you a question because I don't know if you'll be offended by it. If we're both men, we can ask and answer the question. And that's what I expect. If you think I'm a man, if we respect each other as men, that's what we ought to do. And frankly, much more of that should be happening. We have a lot of things that ought to be discussed among different groups of people. It's not just a white and black issue. It's just that in this situation, the fear of being called a racist shuts down common sense in a lot of ways. And my appeal is, take this as just a matter of respect. If you respect someone and you love them, you will confront them when they're acting foolishly. And that's my general appeal to people.
But wouldn't you say now? I mean, and again, I'm out here in the middle of nowhere. There's no protests.
Exactly.
There's barely a coronavirus, issue. Although the cases have gone up, but that's a different story. But wouldn't you say at this point too? I mean, from what I see from the media that I get, I mean, it's not the African American community in and of itself that's out there causing a lot of issues. It's not like we should look at it in that sense. It is really this group that's backed by Antifa or Black Lives Matter. And again, I don't think Black Lives Matter represents the African American community. I think it represents a very radical ideology that's probably not even close to just the norm for the African American community. It is the radical. It's just like, Bernie Sanders doesn't represent the norm for white America. He represents the norm for a very progressive, younger generation a lot of times. But so, I think that's something that we have to, if we know that's the case as well, then we need to go in there and address this. Like you're saying, I think people are afraid because, like, if we do something, we're acting against the African American community. That's almost like an insult. If that's
and that's important because the reality is that people talk about the silent majority and things of that nature. When it comes to most of these issues that we're talking about, we agree. And it also means that we don't agree with the radicals on either side. The reality is that, just thinking in terms of pure observations on my end, there's a difference between the Black Lives Matter protesters that come from Charleston and the general people who live in the Charleston area. That we both see that there are certain problems that can be addressed, but only one is calling for a full-scale removal of the police. Only one is calling for the entire police to be owned by Black people, essentially. Only one group of people is calling for full reparations because of this issue. Only one group of people is doing that at this point in Charleston. It's the Black Lives Matter people. So in one sense, yes, it's a minority position within African Americans. Most African Americans are more simple. They're just simply saying, we want to see the police to be demilitarized, and we want to see more de-escalation. And we also want to see in some way or fashion that police officers who do these things are not just going to be slapped on the wrist and passed on to another district. If you boil that down, that's basically what we have heard African Americans say. And again, I've yet to meet people who disagree with that personally.
Right. Police reform, everybody pretty much
everyone agrees with police reform in some way.
You just got to figure out what that looks like and what that means. But I think any sane individual, any rational individual.
Now, at the same time, I also want to say we are also seeing new polls coming out that shows that 60% of the country seems to be agreeing with the Black Lives Matter movement. So polls are showing that they're no longer considered the fringe side. More people are coming over to their position. And what we are also knowing, we also know statistically at this point, is that when it comes to the white population in this country, there is a real sense, and I think this has come up in other articles before, there's a sense in which a great awakening has happened to a lot of white liberals in this country. And the great awakening in this case is the first time that they have really seen, or at least believe, that systemic racism exists. And so what this means is that you had a bunch of people in 2004, 2005, who basically were indifferent to racial matters, and they basically thought, no, the country is fine. And then at some point, they read a couple of books and they get woke. They go through a great awakening. And now they are essentially crusaders of what is now called anti-racism. And this crusade is growing in terms of the mentality. Not all of them will basically be doing what the Black Lives Matter movement is doing, but there is a growing number of people who basically believe that it's not enough to be non-racist. You now must actively fight and do the anti-racism thing full orb. That's basically your life. And you've seen, if you kind of just follow people on Twitter, you've seen things like this, where this is why we have to get rid of Aunt Jemima from the actual label. This is why we have to remove Uncle Ben. This is why we have to do all of these things to prove that we're no longer racist. And so other people have discussed this in more detail in terms of articles, but this is actually, to me, the more concerning issue, is that the standard now no longer is, I will treat you equally because we are equals. The standard is now, I have to somehow prove that I'm not racist to you. And I have to kind of fall over backwards to do this.
Well, and it's also, we're gonna get rid of racism by having only white people on our food products. Yeah, makes no sense to me. Yeah. I mean, it's only going to be white folks that can be on the labels. No black. It makes no sense. And Aunt Jemima's granddaughter, I read, is not happy that they're taking her grandmother off the. Yeah, and again, I say this is a little bit separate topic, but I've just thought about it just more and more. Just that you don't put something, and again, there might be racial tones to when they created these products, but you wouldn't keep an African-American woman, or you would have Aunt Jemima, Uncle Ben, the guy that's on the cream of wheat they're getting rid of. If you didn't think you were going to sell the product, you wouldn't put them on the product. Yeah. And so I personally don't quite get the, at least not today. Again, maybe 50 years ago, 60 years ago, it meant something different than it does today. But I don't understand.
This is this is the era of woke capitalism.
Oh yeah.
But every CEO has to basically prove themselves that they are no longer racist, or we have to prove that we're not racist by absurd forms of flattery and lots of words without meaning.
I should have shined your shoes whenever we started this.
Yeah, apparently, yeah, exactly.
Or you need to Chick-fil-A owner shined.
Yeah, exactly. Or you need to walk up to black people and confess how beautiful they are, because apparently they don't know that. So a lot of these sort of things. It's just, this is the era we're living in, and this is part of people losing their common moral sense. Once you do this parade in which you have to prove all of these things, again, you don't really think we're equals here. You really think that I need you to lift me up from wherever you think I am. And no, that's insulting to virtually every black person I know. The basic issue that used to be what civil rights movement was about was, we're fighting for equal protection, and so you can leave us alone. That was basically it. That was the whole goal until the 70s came along.
And it's just, it's the classic quote, right, from Martin Luther King Jr. was about being judged not based upon your skin color, but on the content of your character. Yeah. And it's like we've just gone in the opposite direction. Unless I missed something. Did I miss something? I feel like we just left behind that mandate, if you want to call it a mandate, from Martin Luther King Jr., work towards that goal, and it's just gone.
Well, I mean, we live in an age of equivocation as well. So when it comes to dealing with matters of white-black relations, there's on one end you're saying that whiteness is not really an ethnic group, it's a social construct, but then it's really white people. That's the problem. So we're in a time when Martin Luther King's statement, which was a statement of moral sense, is being overturned by absurdities. And the cry that I think most people should have is, can we actually get back to a normal, do we actually have a common ground that we can get back to? Or are we at this point in which we can't even speak to each other without you genuflecting to me and me accepting your offering before we talk? Like, is that where we're going at this point? If that is where we're going, that means, again, we're not at all talking to each other as equals. We're talking to each other as two different. We don't think of each other in the same category, in the same boat, with the same problems at this point.
Well, brother, I mean, that's the common ground that we have, that we know, is that we're all totally depraved, right? We're all sinners, and only by the grace of God do we have any worth whatsoever. Our worth comes from Christ, and I just, again, I feel like, as I told you before we went on, I've thought about this kind of stuff for a long time, but I've never come to good conclusions in my own mind of what I personally can do, other than what you're saying. I just have to be a godly person to everyone I meet. But that doesn't get it done fast enough for me, right? And that's just my impatience. And it doesn't solve problems in Minneapolis or Seattle with me trying to just be, again, it starts person to person. I just have to be a godly man and treat everyone equally where I'm at. But I want to see it. I want to see God at work everywhere, solving this problem. But obviously, for His purposes, it's not happening. And so this is the one thing that I personally I've never been able to wrap my brain around, about why we can't get past this. As we said before, we naturally, all men naturally, anywhere in the world, divide themselves on ethnic lines, based upon looks, based upon skin color, based upon eye shape, based upon the size of your nose. I mean, we do it all over the world. I mean, I've heard that Koreans can be some of the most racist people in the world. They're more racist than we are here, is what they say. Again, I don't know that for a fact. But I hope and pray that what's happening now, through all of this chaos that's going on around different places, we'll be able to have more discussions like this, that we can move this forward in a godly way somehow. You have any? Yeah.
Yeah, and there is much that, so kind of go back a little bit. As you mentioned, it is very difficult to have any multi-ethnic society. And this is something that is not uniquely American. It's kind of exasperated for Americans because we have so many ethnic groups kind of piled together. And the whole melting pot analogy does kind of breaks down here, because in the melting pot, things tend to settle. But no, we actually get conflicts when we have multiple ethnic groups here. And you have the sinfulness of man. You have the sinfulness of men acting with one another in different ways. If you think about the idea of racism, you can think of total depravity acting in a couple of ways, meaning that you can have a group of individuals acting in such a way to create laws and systems that are basically prejudiced and wicked towards another group of people. That's one form of total depravity working. Another form of total depravity working is realizing that there is no political way to root out racism from the heart. Every time we change a law, we can find racist people, in a sense, to try to maneuver around that law to do what they want to do. again, these are pervasive issues, not just merely American issues that we're dealing with. Now, one of the things that we can also say with confidence is that when it comes to the Christian church, we know what our standard is. So our standard is not merely to keep people away from each other so that violence and hostility doesn't break forth. That's not the Christian standard. That's the standard of politics. Keep things pretty peaceful. The Christian standard is pretty clear. You get that from Ephesians 2, where if Jews and Gentiles themselves can be reconciled by the one sacrifice of Jesus Christ, how much more can different Gentiles be reconciled to one another? If we really have one Lord, one faith, and one baptism, and one Father over all, that means we all come to the same fountain. We, as the expression is, we all are equal at the foot of the cross. It also means we all drink from the same spiritual rock. We all have the same common unity of the faith here. And so when it comes to what the Christian church ought to do, the Christian church ought to, in some way or fashion, be able to say confidently that if we were looking only at our ethnic lines, we would have conflict. But we actually have something that transcends this conflict in a lot of ways. Now, that doesn't mean, practically speaking, that you won't have things to work out. But what the Christian confession does, it means that people who would ordinarily have lots of problems are pulled together by the blood of Christ. That means we don't just walk away from each other because we have ethnic problems. We are tied together at the hip because we're in Christ. And that means there are things we will have to work out as a church, and the friction is going to be palpable. The reality is that, what I've been told by a number of people in the South is that the actual friction that happens going from the Jim Crow era to the modern era, that is a friction that is palpable, that's still there. The reality is that you don't just flip the switch and transform from the Jim Crow South to here without having to deal with all of the consequences of that system, that actual legal system that was involved there. And that's going to be true in different ways at different times. So when I think about what the Christian church does, the Christian church, in terms of sanctification, is going to grow in that unity in very real and practical ways. The Christian church can talk about these issues not with a view of what is this going to mean for national politics, but with a view of how do we actually love and get along with one another in the local church. Now, in the article that I mentioned, one of the greatest pushback I got from the article actually comes from people who basically believe have never experienced racism before. They came to that conclusion because I decided to brag about the goodness of many white Christians towards me and my family. That's the problems we have today, is that to compliment people, to actually praise people for their kindness towards me, is to basically, in some people's eyes, to say, oh, you never really dealt with a problem. The reason I do that is because the reality is that I have never experienced that type of kindness except from the Christian church, personally. I can speak about what went on in the world. That's one thing. But in the Christian church, there have been positives and negatives that have happened. I kind of gave the positive into what that happens. In terms of my own personal life, it was the testimony of many white brothers and sisters that gave me a good sense of what family is and why it is centrally important. It was the testimony of many white brothers and sisters that gave me a love for the church and why you fight for the church. It was the testimony of lots of brothers and sisters who, while I could not be with my wife in the very early days of our marriage because I was going to fly to different places to find a job, they were the ones who cared for my wife, and they didn't know her very well. They knew her because they loved me, basically. It was the kindness of many people along the way. When my daughter almost died as an infant, it was the local church, Christ Church in particular, that surrounded us, loved us, took care of my older daughter, and helped us walk through a life and death situation. So the reality is that those experiences are not just, happenstance things. The reality is that this is what we are as Christians, that even though we struggle at times to understand each other, we know that when push comes to shove, these are who we ought to fight for. And that's why I have that statement of loving your neighbors and defending them. These are your people, in a sense. If you think about the Christian church, these are your neighbors that God has given you, and you are called to love them fiercely. And so that's going to appear in different ways, but in a practical, interpersonal way, this is how you actually deal with residual hostilities and residual stereotypes that you have among different ethnic groups in the church. You have to walk with them for years to get to that point. And that's the reality. Not everyone is going to have that not everyone's going to actually have that experience, because they may not have different ethnic groups in your area. You may just have you and people of your same ancestry. That's fine. You don't try to fabricate it or make it artificial by busing people in. We're not doing the political solution here. The reality is that some of you live in those sort of areas. There shouldn't be guilt because you don't have Black people in your area if you live in Nebraska, basically. At the same time, if you live in Charleston or you live in Houston, for instance, is a very ethnically diverse area. You're going to have lots of opportunities to have wonderful fellowship and lots of friction with your brothers and sisters in Christ. But because we are one in Christ, you fight for that. You don't just simply say, I don't understand those people, and therefore I'm going to be aloof with them. The reality is that you have a greater unity with them in Christ than you have with your physical family. And that's what you are fighting for. That's why you keep pressing forward, even when it's hard to do. And that's just the reality of what it means to grow as the church and grow in Christ. So there's a lot of interpersonal things that happen. So if you think about all these national things that happen, you could just ask yourself a simple question. How does this affect the people in my church? How does this affect the people I actually live with, walk with, cry with, and rejoice with? In a very simple way, you actually build and you actually practically solve a lot of problems you're trying to address if you have that in view, rather than trying to see everything as this big political hurrah that we have to kind of come together to try to figure out. Most people are not.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing. And then hopefully, as you're telling those stories, as we walk together, you don't have to say they were white Christians or they were Black Christians or they were Hispanic. They were just Christians.
Yeah,
I mean, that doesn't mean again, we need to celebrate. I think Vodi Bakum talks about that. We need to celebrate, the cultures that we have. I think it was Vodi. You could correct me if I'm wrong, but it's like, I don't need to not see who you are. I mean, you're an African American from New York and through Atlanta and now in Charleston, and that says a lot about who you are. That's good and unique, and God made you the way you are. And I'm a Southern guy that's ended up in Nebraska, and I'm surrounded by German Russians, and it's and all of those things make up the world, and it's a beautiful thing, but we need to celebrate that, and we need to. I don't know. Again, like I said, if I had this figured out, I'd write a book and make $1 million, right? But I just think, like you're saying, it's all local. It's all about who you're around, loving your neighbor, those people that are directly around you, and then just praying for those folks that are in these other areas, that God will raise up godly men and women to answer the call to put an end to some of the foolishness that's going on. And like you said, people being able to accept, being able to go up to somebody and say, you need to stop what you're doing. Doesn't matter whether I'm black and you're white or whatever. This is foolishness. Foolishness is foolishness. And we need to put an end to it. I don't want to take up too much more of your time. Lord willing, we're going to have you on again sometime in the future. We'll talk about science.
Oh, yeah. That'd be good.
And faith. And you can tell us all about, creation.
Sure.
And how it relates to hurricanes. How the fall brought about hurricanes. But man, it's been good to have you, and I'm thankful for your willingness to come on here and talk with us and share with us, and just blessings to you and everything that's going on there, and I will keep you in my prayers and your church there as well. And you said John Payne, is that right? Is the pastor there?
That's
I'm
correct.
familiar with him. I can't remember why, but I'm familiar with him. But yeah. Any last words? I don't want to cut you off without having some last thought you might have.
No, it's my expectation and encouragement to those is the same. We are much more alike than we are different. And if it is your desire to begin to talk about these things in a frank and honest way, it's best to start among the people you know in your church. And that means take the time to have not just difficult conversations, but expect that you probably will have a number of things you will agree with. You'll probably be surprised at some things people will believe in. And you're going to have to work through these as Christians. And so take the time and by God's grace, walk through these things with your brothers and sisters.
Amen. Thanks, Gabe. Thanks to Dr. Williams. And we will talk to all you guys again soon. God bless. Have a good evening.
Take care.